an honor to be invited here to moderate this panel made up of two old pals of mine and Maryantonett, who I've come more recently to know. As I wasn't being heard, I will first acknowledge with appreciation the place and presence of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and express my appreciation to the IOG for this invitation. By the way, how many of you have any idea what a specific claim might be? All right, well, yeah, and you know, it's a bit of a delicate question to ask, but how many in the room have actually read a decision of the Specific Claims Tribunal? Now, be honest. Well, it's more than I thought. I thought it was only the Federal Court of Appeal that read these decisions. And by the way, the Supreme Court of Canada will be reading one tomorrow on appeal from a reversal of a decision of mine by the Federal Court of Appeal. So first, I'll introduce Paul Chartrand. Paul and I first met at the home of Professor Brad Morse some years back in New Zealand, and we were joined there by Joe Williams of the New Zealand High Court and former head of the Waitangi Tribunal. Among the four of us, there was a lot of good talk, fueled by good food and a couple of drinks. And I've since had the pleasure of talk, good food, and a couple of drinks with Paul. So Paul has a brief presentation on a couple of points, unless he's changed his mind, which of course is allowed. Paul will identify some basic concepts that can animate fresh approaches to disputes on jurisdiction between First Nations and Canada, and will introduce the concept of subsidiary, which comes from well, here we go. I think a philosopher, Althusius, and it's something that's reflected in the approach taken internally within the European Union. The aim of this is to suggest that common values held by the parties indicate basic values and principles that call for an abandonment of long-held views and policies. More on the pragmatic side, the parties, Paul will say, have to get to the negotiating table. And the relationship between consent as a guiding principle and good faith negotiation will be explored along with the role of the courts. So, Paul, with that.
I begin by thanking the Institute on Governance for inviting me to participate in this interesting conference. I hasten to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose territory we are privileged to be meeting. My topic is about conceptualizing jurisdiction, the title of the panel, conceptualizing, thinking about. This morning in the newspaper, the Globe and Mail, also fondly known as the Mop and Pail, there's an article about the Federal Minister of Indian Affairs, now called Indigenous Affairs, Minister Bennett. She's reported being in New York City for the sessions this week of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and is reported as declaring that in Canada, we make decisions together. My topic today suggests that the idea of making decisions together can indeed replace disputes over jurisdiction in First Nations self-government negotiations. The concept of subsidiarity is an idea that seeks to balance solidarity with autonomy. Subsidiarity asks not who has the power to do X, rather it asks who should do X. Before I go on, let me tell you about my favorite memory about speaking about the concept of subsidiarity, which is not an idea that's familiar to everyone. A few years ago, I was speaking to a small group of chiefs in Manitoba, where I mentioned this concept of subsidiarity, and Chief Morris Shanakapo, who was very well known for his wonderful sense of humor, put up his hand and he said to me, he says, Paul, what is that big word again? He said, I want to use it at least once back home on the reserve. My own interest in the concept of subsidiarity dates back a few decades. Some of you who have followed the research work associated with Canada's Federal Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples might remember or know about the research paper done by Professor Hugelin of Wilfrid Laurier University that was back in 1993. The concept of subsidiarity is also recognized in international human rights law, and it has been fairly well known in research and deliberations in Australia in its application to Aboriginal governance. In Canada, the concept has not been very well known or deliberated, although I was very interested to see that it has been making its way into recent constitutional law. And it's quite interesting to notice that the concept of subsidiarity, which is introduced in Canadian constitutional law in the context of the division of powers, has been notably developed in Aboriginal rights cases, the Chilcotin case and the Keewatin cases, in the context of what is called interjurisdictional immunity. But it's an idea that has not made a lot of headway so far as I can tell. But I've been intrigued by contrasting the disputes over who has the power, jurisdictional wrangling, as it were, in Canada, while we look across the Atlantic and we see one of the most powerful political and economic blocs on the planet operates on the basis of a treaty relationship. And we know that in Canada, that it is the treaty relationship that is the constitutional link between all the interests of the First Nations and Canada as a state. And indeed, when we look closely at what binds the European Union, we find the concept of subsidiarity, a concept that values deliberation and agreement. And it replaces the disputes such as we have in Canada, where we have a process here where typically what you see is each party going to his own corner and pass their own laws and then get back together and try to coordinate them. What I'm saying is that subsidiarity is worth considering in First Nations self-government negotiations in respect to the establishment of nation-to-nation relationships. Underlying my suggestion is the idea that thinking about these particular relationships, thinking about the concept of subsidiarity is a useful initiative, and I'll come back to that. I must start, in order to explain what I mean and what is meant by subsidiarity, explain a few basic terms to make sense of the idea of subsidiarity and how it can be put to use in what is called a nation-to-nation relationship. So I very briefly identify what I mean by these terms: peoples, nation, and citizen. Of course, for my purposes today, a people is a Section 35 Constitution Act 1982 people. And I adopt the view of the Royal Commission in its reports in 1995-96 that peoples are organic, political, and cultural entities that stem historically from the original peoples of North America. I emphasize that people, on the other hand, are the persons that belong to peoples. And I say that even to this audience because this has got to be one of the most confused bits of terminology in Canadian writing. A nation, on the other hand, was defined this way by the RCAP: a sizable body of Aboriginal people who possess a shared sense of national identity and constitute the predominant population in a certain territory or collection of territory. The concept of nationalism, of course, is a very complex idea and process, which I don't want to have the time to elaborate on, but I might compare it to an old sock that has been darned by new wool over many, many, many years. Is it still the same thing, or is this still the same sock as the original one? So, as Ernest Renan, the French philosopher, famously reminded us, a nation consists of a daily plebiscite. The idea of citizenship, which has been raised in the context of this particular conference, is an intriguing one. My understanding is that the idea of the citizen describes the relationship between the individual member of a state. It describes the relationship between the state and the citizen. And the state is a modern European invention. So far as I can tell, we see its origins in the 1648 Treaties of Westphalia. And what interests me is the use to which it is put in the context of nation-to-nation relationships for Indigenous people in Canada. I'm a little puzzled, and what I do wonder about is, well, at what point in our history, the evolution of history of state-Indigenous relations in Canada, shall we see the First Nations turn inward in the philosophies and histories, their own philosophies and histories, and pick their words to describe what is the proper relationship between the individual and the community to which that individual belongs. I won't say any more on that. For those who may be interested, I have written, published work on the idea of a citizen and used it as a model to analyze state-Indigenous relationships. What is subsidiarity? There are at least 5 different theories of subsidiarity. And I'm aware there are at least also 5 different theories of constitutional interpretation. So when you consider both those propositions, I get the sinking feeling that whatever I say this afternoon about the subsidiarity in the context of division of powers, I shall do a lousy job. But let me just identify very quickly some of the key concepts that has appealed to various commentators on subsidiarity. So Professor Uglin himself described it as an expression of a complex relationship and tension between autonomy and solidarity in a multi-level system of governance that can claim universal validity, whether in family and kinship relations, or in federal systems, or in international political order. The European Union, of course, in the Article 3B of the Maastricht Treaty, has established a treaty-based flexible accommodation system. A federal system of constitutional power division is replaced in the European Union by subsidiarity, where action by the European community is tied to negotiated criteria of efficiency and necessity. And this is the way, and here are some very simple, straightforward statements that come from analysts associated with the Australian research projects. Incidentally, the idea of subsidiarity has its origins in medieval Catholic theology, but it has evolved, as I've mentioned before, in a number of ways. And I think for a number of reasons, it is an idea that really deserves examination. A basic proposition is this: never entrust to a bigger unit anything that is best done by a smaller one. The subsidiarity is the principle of decision-making as close to the level of the individual citizen as is appropriate for the circumstances. Third statement is central authorities are allocated decisions that transcend local particularities. And in the European Union, of course, it's the tests of efficiency or appropriateness that determine the situations in which higher level decisions are to be made. In the very short time available to me, allow me to very briefly make the case for subsidiarity. Think about these ideas. Everyone is presumed to know best how to govern his own life. Every person is better acquainted with their own preferences, values, life plans, and is better placed to decide trade-offs between interests and objectives. These propositions can be generalized to social institutions. The next point is a family member. Family members presumptively know each other better than strangers do. Third, members of a local community are more likely acquainted with the shared values and interests of their neighbors and are better placed to decide on ways of governance. I find that these levels are well suited to the Maori social structures of the family, the village, and the clan, the whanau, hapu, and iwi. In regards to its application to Indigenous people, the proposal is this: that a cultural identity is more achievable in a social environment where that cultural identity is recognized and valued. In Australia, a philosopher analyzing Aboriginal governance there concluded that subsidiarity favors self-determination of local Aboriginal communities over power in the states or the Commonwealth government, which is the name of the central government there. An important point about appreciating the concept of subsidiarity, besides the fact that it eliminates disputes about who has authority, rather than ask the question who should do what. It's task allocation rather than division of powers. It's not it is joint rather than concurrent authority to act. The onus, look at from the perspective of the Aboriginal people, the onus is on the dominant party. Given the propositions that I have mentioned to make the case for subsidiarity, the onus is on the dominant party, which would be the government, to make the case for a higher level decision making. So I think this is a powerful, powerful idea. My last point has to do with the next question. Suppose then that we jettison disputes about who has the power to do what and replace it with the idea who should do what. Then what? Because we have a situation where we have unequal power balance between the negotiating parties. We have a dominant party. Here I rely on the constitutional value and the constitutional principle of consent. Consent in relation to constitutional legitimacy. This is a fundamental idea that Canada has adopted for itself, so is very ill-placed to reject it in its application for the Aboriginal people. We know that in historic treaties, the consent of the First Nations was sought. These then can be viewed as bargains of confederation. And these fit well within the compact theory, as it was articulated, for example, recently, this will be known to the lawyers in the audience, by Madame Justice Deschamps in her vigorous dissent in the Beckman case. The basic constitutional principle in Canada is that consent legitimizes de facto constitutional authority. And that's from a long line of cases, including the Manitoba language reference case of 1985, Quebec secession reference case, and the Mitchell and Minister of National Revenue case. So I've argued in my published work that there is a duty to negotiate in proper circumstances where, such as in negotiations to establish the state-indigenous relationship in Canada, or if you wish, the nation-to-nation relationship in Canada, there is, in particular circumstances, a duty to negotiate the terms of the Constitution under which the Aboriginal nation is prepared to live, on the same principles that the courts have developed for Canadians generally. Conceptualizing then is about the way that people think about a subject. And I've suggested that the way that people think about jurisdiction is important. And I've suggested that the idea of jurisdictional disputes is not necessary, that philosophically it can be replaced with the concept of subsidiarity, which seeks to balance solidarity with autonomy. Thank you for listening to me as I had the opportunity here to think out loud about jurisdiction.
Paul, I hope you'll forgive me for failing to mention your several academic degrees and your involvement in many, many important initiatives, but I think everybody has your biography, and it's my pleasure next to introduce Harold Calla. Now, Harold and I have known each other for getting on around 30 years, both being very, very young men in our early 20s when we first met. Right, Harold? Yeah. Yeah. And I was legal counsel for the Squamish Nation, and Harold appeared on the scene as a member and a rising figure within the nation. And he's a qualified certified general accountant, and I thought, I better be a little more careful in my billing practices, as we're about to be visited by a soulless bean counter. However, it wasn't long before Harold disabused me of the idea that certified general accountants are soulless, and we've had many good years of friendship. Now, Harold has led, supported, and maintains an important role in advancing First Nation control of their reserve land base and their financial affairs, including the implementation of regimes of taxation on interests in reserve land, in particular in relation to non-Indigenous interests. He's also pioneered and championed the access of First Nations to capital independently of government. All of this at the community level, creating pathways out of the heavy hand that we have seen historically, and of the administration under the Indian Act, which has so balkanized the Indigenous nations. I think most would agree, perhaps all, that in the contemporary world as we have it today, with its complexities, new complexities, experience, hands-on experience in First Nations in these areas will inform and foster the ultimate exercise of inherent powers of governance as the reconciliation project moves forward. So with that, Harold,
Thank you for the invitation today. I feel sorry for those who have heard me speak again. You're probably going to, I remember when I served on the board at CMHC, they used to give you script to read as you'd go up and speak. And always at the bottom of it, it would be somebody in the audience would have something that said, check to delivery. So make sure that I'm saying what I'm supposed to. I'm going to start by explaining who I am and the lens that I see things through, because I think that's important. Not unlike Ovid, when my mother married my stepfather, she enfranchised and I with her at the age of 3.5. The Squamish Nation was a community of 16 Indian bands that was created through the reserve allocation process. And from 1919 to 1923, 16 of those communities engaged in negotiations that resulted in the creation of the Squamish Nation, through a prayer, I might add. Since that time, since 1923 up until now, for 50 of those years, my grandfather, my uncle, or I have served on council. Up until 1981, we did not have elections. Our leadership was chosen from our families and served until they died. In 1981, we went to an elected system and incorporated the on and off reserve because most of our population lived within 5 miles of the reserve if they couldn't live on it. I grew up 66 feet from the reserve, right next to the old Indian day school in North Vancouver, and my uncle used to come up before all of the council meetings and would sit and have coffee in our kitchen, and I would listen. I was told to go out and learn, as they used to say in those days, the white man's way, and to come back. And I became an accountant. worked in international business, and at the age of 39, they came to me. I received an invitation from the community and an order from my aunt to come home and begin to work. And then I realized what a challenge that was. And I realized for the first time that those stories I had heard in our kitchen table that I thought were just bitter people were realities I had never understood. I tell the story about going to the bank after I first arrived because our community needed an accountant because they were about to become insolvent. Had money, but weren't managing it. And I had to go to the bank and borrow some money. Now, previously, I'd been in international business, and nobody ever challenged anything that I wanted to do. I was capable of making decisions, and I went to the bank and I said, I need to borrow $250,000 for 30 days. And he said to me, you'll need the minister. And not realizing they didn't have a sense of humor, bankers, I said I didn't think I was in a church. It was the first time I sat across the table and was addressed as an Indian. And I was furious. I was given an opportunity by many of our hereditary chiefs who took me under their wing and afforded me opportunity. One of the first meetings I was at was an AFN meeting. I was around during those constitutional conversations. I was around during the establishment of the summit. And I was around when our community made the decision that we couldn't make the changes we needed to make just by working from within. We had to move outside. We had to involve our neighbors, our relatives, and everyone else across the country. And so we began looking at how we could move from the Indian Act. And they weren't popular decisions. We caused many a national chief a big headache over the legislative reforms that we wanted to make. We've come here today to talk about jurisdiction. But what is it? Often we get confused by the mechanics and the administration of jurisdiction without really talking about what it is, and I was very pleased to see some of the conversation by Ovid and our senator. And again, I'm going to speak through my lens, because that's all I can speak through. Which at one point, I think Chief Joe Mathias referred to me as the economic mercenary of the Squamish Nation. Modern speak. But what is it? And I think I describe jurisdiction as the ability to determine how you're going to carry yourself. And then to have the ability to be able to articulate that, to say what it is, to describe it as a vision. Jurisdiction allows and requires others to respect that vision and follow it. Jurisdiction allows for there to be remedies for those who won't follow the jurisdiction. I've been to many a political meeting in my 30 years, and every one of those political speeches are absolutely correct. I regret to say it's been the same speech over the last 30 years that I've heard. And it's just as valid today as it was then. And the only way we have made change is when we do what was described earlier, is we stand up and make change. We don't wait for others to give us change. We have to have that attitude. We can't wait for something to be given to us. We have to go and develop it and take it. Barry gave me some questions that I was supposed to answer. so I'll try and answer them, Barry. And one of those was, how have the defining features of exercising jurisdiction evolved? Well, I think it goes back to the Royal Proclamation, quite frankly. What was the Royal Proclamation all about? And I'm going to put on my economic mercenary hat. It was about how the newcomers could get access as under their laws to our lands and resources. There was no social meaning to it, in my view. And in doing so, they failed to recognize the importance of existing First Nation governments. And they failed to recognize the need to allow those First Nation governments to evolve as the rest of society has evolved in the last 300 years. We got frozen in time. And now we're being asked to step out of the freezer and jump into the 21st century. What did Canada do? They created 634 Indian bands, dismantled our nations and our institutions. And that exists today. There's another view of jurisdiction. That's Harold's view as an Aboriginal perspective. I think as Ovid said earlier, people are afraid of Aboriginal jurisdiction. It's been influenced by the interpretations of treaty, Aboriginal land rights, and the evolving law around these matters as being described in many of the Supreme Court of Canada decisions. In the late 60s, we thought we were getting self-government, but we got self-administration of programs and services that were defined by others, both in terms of content and eligibility. Economic and fiscal jurisdictional issues were often raised to meet the interests of non-Aboriginals or to limit or extinguish the risks associated with the potential interpretation and application of Aboriginal rights and title. We're still back in 1763, and it's still about the money, the land, and the resources. All you have to do is look at the natural resource extraction sector today to understand that reality. I was pleased to say that one of the big issues that's impacting jurisdiction is the fact that we became a federal government issue or problem. We were handed off by the provinces to the federal government, and the federal government made decisions between 91-24 and 92, and we cannot talk about jurisdiction in a new nation-to-nation relationship without engaging with the provinces, because they directly impact us. The next question that Barry asked is, what challenges do you foresee between the assertion of an evolving notion of jurisdiction and the current legal framework? The biggest question is going to be, is there a willingness on the part of non-Aboriginal governments to make room for Aboriginal governments? And is there a willingness on the part of Aboriginals to move beyond the Indian Act band structure and begin reconstituting our nations and choose to become part of the Federation of Canada as governments? This is work on our part. There are 217 First Nations across Canada that have scheduled themselves to the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. This act promotes the exercise of taxing jurisdiction, access to capital in an unsecured environment without government guarantees, and an accountable, transparent regime. We modeled after the BC Municipal Finance Authority, and it has received an investment grade rating from the rating agencies, and we sell debentures in New York. I go into those communities because they all need resources, they all have needs, and they all are beginning to understand that the 12-month funding cycle of the Department of Indian Affairs is not the basis on which you can run modern-day governments. But when we first walk in there, they want to know what we're going to give them. And I was in Manitoba at the Roseau community, meeting between their hereditary and elected council. And I said, we're not giving you anything. What we're giving you is an opportunity to help yourself and to provide some guidance on how that might happen. To develop a financial administration law, to put in a good financial management system, and to get access to capital, to develop community and economic plans. We can share the experience that we've gained from our own communities and from those communities that we work with, but we're not here to give you anything. We're here to help you do the work and to provide some exposure from the experience that we've gained on how that can be done. You cannot have a nation-to-nation relationship, and you cannot talk about jurisdiction without talking about taxing jurisdiction, revenue sharing. And we have to get over this, what Chief Joe Mathias described at the signing of the treaty process, the tired old notion of extinguishment of Aboriginal rights and title. Aboriginal rights and title are here to stay. We all better learn how to work with them and how we can benefit as a country from that. Jurisdictions that we've been able to exercise over my time anyway have really related to the delivery of programs and services. We have demonstrated through the Education Steering Committee here in British Columbia and the First Nations Health Authority that we're better to organize ourselves to deliver programs and services to our communities, and those things should continue to develop. But we also need to respect the need for national standards. This notion that I am completely unique and I can do anything that I want because I'm an Indian or an Indian band, I think has to be debated. We need national standards. Canada and the provinces need to develop a transition mechanism for this jurisdictional transfer that does not allow existing programs and departments to hold power over this change. You're asking people to eat themselves if you do. We need another mechanism than saying to the Department of Indian Affairs, let's talk about how you're going to devolve department. We've got involved in a pilot project in Manitoba on intervention. And it's really demonstrated to me that until the department is just moved out of the picture, that conflict can't be overcome. Canada needs to understand, and First Nations need to understand, that there will never be enough transfer funding. You can create legislation, you can do things, but there will never be enough transfer funding because the deficit, the financial deficit is now so large, it cannot be borne by the existing system without the engagement of the private sector and the capital markets. Our jurisdictions need to reflect that. I asked the question when I've been before parliamentary committees is what elements of the Canadian Federation do First Nations have the opportunity to benefit from? And I have said Canada's balance sheet is one of those. If we're going to invest in major resource development, if we're going to invest in our own economic development and we need debt and equity, that should be there. And there are easy economic arguments that can be made why that is a good thing, both for Canada and for ourselves. But Canada has an important role to play in that. This issue that Harry spoke about, why do we have a specific claims commission? Why do we need one? Because there's an unwillingness to resolve these issues. Why do we have to fight for 10 years to get to additions to reserve? We have to resolve these issues because, in part, the provinces don't want Federal Reserve land. The Department of Finance doesn't want additions to reserve land because it means Section 87. We have to overcome these issues, and we have to get to the point where we're able to contribute to the modern day economies. The last big point on this question that I'm going to have is, are we going to have the patience? Is Canada going to have the patience to allow First Nations to catch up and develop the capacity, gain the experience, and develop the legislative framework to create the certainty that's going to be needed for jurisdictions to be applied in a way that doesn't create risk and doesn't harm our economy? The next question that Barry asked is, how do we ensure exercising jurisdiction leads to better economic development outcomes and improved social well-being? I think there's two kind of buckets of economic development. And I think following the Chilcotin decision, there's a much bigger perspective now on where we should be benefiting, not just from our reserve land, but from our traditional territories. I think First Nations need to be able to see the economic benefits arising from economic development activity in their traditional territories, whether it's on reserve or within the traditional territories itself. Joint decision making, jurisdiction around those issues. Recently, my community, Squamish, was forced to consider an LNG facility at Woodfibre. We made the decision that we would not participate in the provincial and federal EA processes. They were suspended. The province actually had to make some regulatory changes, I think, to make that happen. We undertook the work, issued our own certificate, created a contractual obligation on the part of the proponent that included a requirement for there to be a successful economic benefit sharing arrangement, or the certificate was pulled. Bold step. And it was easy to do because we were one community. I look at these linear projects and wonder how that kind of an attitude can prevail, but it is. We're working with the communities in northern British Columbia, 31 of them, who are starting to develop these approaches. They have to make room for us as governments to exercise jurisdiction. We have to go to the table prepared to exercise it, and we have to be prepared to do the work. Greater access to capital will certainly fund infrastructure and equity that's required. You need infrastructure for economic development in our communities to bring economic development to the communities. How many people have received Department of Indian Affairs transfer funding for economic development infrastructure in this room? Thank you. You made the point. We need to incent the private sector to invest in Aboriginal communities through loan guarantees and the use of the tax system, including concepts around investment tax credit or reduced tax rates. Encouraging partnerships with the private sector will build First Nation capacity and experience more quickly and mitigate risk. Too often in the communities that I visit across the country, we have a romantic notion about what economic development is. It's not based in reality. Okay? Part of what's required with the financial administration law and financial management systems is the development of a risk register. And this notion as a counselor that you don't have to be the expert in everything, that you can get advice. And that it should be process-based decision-making instead of personality-based decision-making around some of these issues. What does governance look like if jurisdiction is not land-based? And first of all, I'm going to say that there can never be jurisdiction if it's not land-based from an Aboriginal perspective. But it did raise some interesting topics that I do think need to be discussed. And that is particularly around the portability of rights, citizenship and membership, and to define who has the responsibility for the provision of services. And a fiscal relationship that has a taxation and revenue sharing framework that would require the funding for the provision of those services. Our resources need to come off the top, not the crumbs from the bottom. We should not be dependent on the generosity of the parliamentary appropriation process after every other priority has been met for our services to be developed. And I think we need to develop national institutions. After 30 years, as much as I hate to admit it, we need our own bureaucracy, we need our own central agencies. Many of the communities that I go and visit now are absolutely starved for information and for an understanding of what they need to do. They do not have the capacity, they do not have the resources, and they do not have the experience. National institutions will permit the exercise of jurisdiction in a way that meets everyone's interests. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Harold. Our next presenter is Maryantonett Flumian, who is known to you all and was earlier introduced, so I won't go into that. And Maryantonett is going to speak of practical measures to advance these interests that have been the topic of our discussion today.
Thank you, Harry. If you can hear me, I'll stay here because I can see all of you, so we can at least make eye contact. In the essence of time that's left to us, I'm going to get into some horrible overgeneralizations, but we can have lots of debates, or I can be booed off the stage later. So let me get on with some of these issues that some have already been touched upon by my colleagues here. As I sit with two eminent jurists and one great leader as well who has lived these issues on a daily basis. So first and foremost, if you forgot it, I'm a recovering public servant. I'm not in the same space as former National Chief Ovid, who saved my butt many times when I worked on some of these issues. I'm not in the space of Harold or Miles or any of the rest of them. But in my own way, maybe I have the soul of a warrior. Because you come to be a public servant, in my judgment, by asking every day, how can you make it better? And you have to be a warrior, for all of you who are in the public service in this room, because government's actually built to stay the same forever. That's one of the attributes of government. And if we're going to make any progress on these issues, if you're not a warrior in your day-to-day jobs, pushing the envelope on all these issues that have been talked about so far today and will be explored tomorrow, well then we're in trouble, because we need people pushing on these issues all over the place. The outside, the inside, First Nations, Inuit, Matey communities, but also on the inside looking in. And all you have to do is talk to someone like Miles or Sophie about their experiences of the Treaty Commission, where they're kind of inside-outside. They understand the pressures of their communities. They're both chiefs in their own right before they got there, and yet they're now part of a bureaucracy that's supposed to advance and change the world. So if you look at it that way, and you think about that, there's one thing that always gets forgotten, which these gentlemen have talked to, and certainly we heard a lot about it in the opening panels. It's all about outcomes. Pushing the envelope on these issues, having the soul of a warrior, is all about making sure that everybody across Canada has the same access to the services, to the opportunities that I had or any one of us could have when things are good. So changing outcomes is what this is all about. So having said that, for me, people have discussed about some of the fundamental components of jurisdiction. And without sounding overly trite, I would say that the issues of jurisdiction in this conversation stand on their own merits and their own legitimacy. And I don't think we have to argue so much about that. If we believe in governance, whether it's self-governance or however people want to define it, then we all have to stand back and take a deep breath and basically trust ourselves and the integrity of the fact that laws as we construct them are a reflection of who we are and how we want to live together. They're not something that has to chain us to a past that all of us, quite frankly, if we're going to make this work, want to run away from. So I would start there, and then I would go to my next point, which is if he wasn't available to be here today, but in addition to all the leaders that are at the UN discussing the 10th anniversary and the important issues that are being discussed there, there's another person who isn't here today, and that's Ian Binney, who couldn't make it. And if he was here today, without my putting words into his mouth, because I've shared many panels with him, he would say something like, the Royal Proclamation, the Constitution, and the courts have provided far more space than either governments or First Nations, Inuit and Matey, have actually taken up. So at that point, I would say there's a lot to be said to the Nike slogan of just do it. And again, I don't say that tritely because there's a lot of hard work, as Harold has just talked about, in just doing it. But I would say that we're not going to reimagine the world if our starting point is not the Royal Proclamation and the Constitution, but that our starting point is the Indian Act 2.0. And a lot of the conversation around these issues sound like the Indian Act 2.0. What should the next generation of the Indian Act look like? Well, it shouldn't exist. That's what it should look like. And therefore, what should exist? So then I come to the view of, okay, I very much appreciated the discussion on the concepts of subsidiarity because we use it all the time in the Canadian federal model, right? It is the jargon of the day for the last 15 years to explain why forever we should be moving jurisdiction closer to the levels of government that are serving people. So, and I like it for another reason, by the way. I spent about 40% of my time in Iraq helping to build a federation, and subsidiarity is a concept that can give life to how you can build strength out of diversity, which is what we're trying to do here, right? So my view would be, if we take the Royal Proclamation and the Constitution as the starting points, then when you want to assert it, when it affects other people, you too have a duty to consult. And where it's concurrent, go ahead with consultation on your part. And where there's a very adverse effect on somebody else, I have faith that we will find ways to sort it out. But if that's the area where our focus is, instead of my telling you never to do it and you telling me you're going to do it but not getting on with it, then we're never going to make progress on these issues. So I figure the starting point is not the Indian Act 2.0. The starting point is the Royal Proclamation, the Constitution, and the expression of our treaties, where they exist, should be viewed through the lenses of how those two documents read, not through the lens of the Indian Act. There's poetry in nation building, and we've talked a little bit about the poetry here today, but how do we get on with this? So, very quickly, to speak to some of the points that have already been made, let's speak to the frameworks and institutions that have to be built by you, sometimes validated by Canada through an act of parliament that gives them legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of Canada, because if we're going to help create and build collective institutions for Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis public purpose, then the flow of money and the flow of all those things that Harold talked about have to be dignified in some fashion. Because it should not be the government of Canada's job, or provincial governments for that matter, to take the 631 First Nations that were created under the Indian Act and recreate some other number of them. You can sort that out if the frameworks and the institutions that give you the scope to manage as nations are put in place. The second aspect of this, and Harold's talked about this as well, is how do you better equip an Indigenous public service acting on behalf of the collective? How do you create that continuity in your own communities that is one of the hallmarks of what makes public services successful throughout the world? And that continuity shouldn't be there to hamstring you, but it certainly should be there to institutionalize the governance practices that, to quote Senator Murray, were interfered with in that transmission of the knowledge of how you governed yourself. So how do we equip that public service? What are we going to do about it? What can we do about that collectively to build the kind of institutional continuity that you need to run these things? Then I would go to how do we create a better support for a new generation of leadership? How do we stop people from being individual survivors in this very brutal game of the politics of never having enough to go around, to building that generation of leadership, not only with an understanding and a sensitivity to the time frames that's expected of them to perform miracles in their own communities, but how do they understand the new Canada? Because Canada doesn't look the way it looked when I was growing up. Look at our cabinet. Look at our parliament. It's a highly diverse country now that probably puts more value on diversity than we ever have as the children of Westminster we once were, which were predominantly of British and all those kinds of things, right? A legal system and so on and so forth. It's a very diverse country, and can we not look to that next generation to help us build and celebrate that diversity of which you were the start? And then finally, again, it's been mentioned several times today, how do we evolve that notion of citizenship? Because it does have to go beyond the land base. It may start there, but it's got to go way beyond it. It already has gone beyond it in terms of Matey and other groups, in terms of the urbanization of the population. That notion of portability, it's still a very important one to define how all of this plays out. So then let me go to, if that's your job, and that's how we can help collectively, let's go to provincial governments. Of course, the Crown is not divisible, except the Crown is divided, right? So provincial governments over the last 25 years have exercised their subsidiarity, their concurrence, and their exclusive jurisdiction in ways that make it a patchwork across Canada. It's not the same, it doesn't look the same. Some degrees it's been very successful, and some others less so, but that's the reality we face. But one thing that has happened with the work of at least two levels of government and you all working together have been the start of important institutional arrays. University systems, Saskatchewan, that look after First Nations interests. BC Health Authority, two levels of government and First Nations. The tax, the Financial Management Board, there have been instances where working together, some of those things I talked about earlier have been accomplished, but how do we make that flourish in a different way? And then quickly, because we're running out of time, is, or at least I am, the role of the federal government. Again, I don't see how anything that we're talking about happens with reference to the Indian Act as a starting point. And I would say that maybe for once, this moment in history, we should look at the current Trudeau, and while I don't think wisely he'd ever reopen constitutional discussions, maybe what he's trying to do is respect Section 35 and the processes he set in place are actually meant to give life to Section 37. And maybe if we look at it that way, we have an opening that takes us beyond the prescriptions of the Indian Act. But the problem here is that INAC is still the primary interlocutor. At the political level, the PM speaks of a relationship that's the most important to him. He's realigned his cabinet committees to pay more attention to that relationship and how it should play out. He's launched through the Department of Justice the review of laws and policies, and he's got cabinet authorities and deputy minister committees aligned there. But I still fear that there's something missing in that machinery. On a day-to-day basis, you're still all struggling, department by department, ministry by ministry. And if you divide that by 634, I think I've got the right number, that's a hell of a slog where there is no symmetry in the relationships. So if this is really about giving some kind of life to Section 37, we don't have alignment in who's at the tables having discussions about the really big issues. You know, intergovernmental and fiscal relationships is not about how you remove the 2% cap and what new formula replaces it. That's not. That's G's and C's on steroids. That's not a nation-to-nation relationship. So if we're serious about making progress on all these fronts, and I have to think at this moment in time, our Prime Minister is serious, then I have to think that sometimes process in government actually does lead to change. Process generally doesn't get put in place just for the sake of process. He's launched at the political level. I'm not sure the bureaucratic level is keeping up. And I'm not sure that there's alignment with Indigenous, Inuit, Métis, First Nations organizations with the political dialogue that's going on. And that is something that's got to be addressed by all of you in different ways, or in rooms where I will not be, so that there is alignment that can lead to perhaps the window and doors having been opened to significant change for all of us. And then very finally, there's the rest of Canada. I've already said a few words about the diversity and how I think there's hope in the future. But I think that we lose a lot of your communities if we don't speak to a vision that also has the urgency of the timeframes. So while I heard very wise men speak to us on our earlier panel about how this will take a generation, that's not an answer all of you can go home and give your communities tomorrow. There's some things that will take a generation, but we need a much more manageable framework of what can happen tomorrow, next year, the year after, the year after, and the year after. And I don't see that the discussions, the way they've been aligned so far around the areas of nation to nation and this issue of jurisdiction are aligned to have that kind of discussion. However, if I wasn't the eternal optimist, I wouldn't be here. And therefore, it's not too late to sort of have some dialogues about what it would take to get this on the track that actually gets us to a better place, I think. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Harold, Paul, Maryantonett. The numbers come up several times, 634 bans, Indian Act bans. And the term First Nation has come into common usage, and it seems to me it's used more frequently to refer to a body of people constituted under the Indian Act as a band. And is it in any way realistic or helpful to speak of a nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and 634 entities defined by a statute that was intended and it came very close to destroying Indigenous collective action by nations. So, Paul, you've spoken of, well, first I want to comment that pick up on what Ovid said about the exercise of jurisdiction necessarily provoking conflict. Well, in the absence of respectful consultation around who should, that is certainly so. But at what level is it appropriate that the nation-to-nation conversation be had so that these conflicts can be avoided? And if the answer is the Indigenous nation, how might they be empowered even reconstituted. And it may be controversial for me to say, but I don't think one can really ignore the fact that the Assembly of First Nations is a band organization. They get their mandate from the chiefs.
I thought I was being kind when I said there's no symmetry. I left it at that.
Yeah. So, as part of the project here, that can only be advanced by Indigenous peoples to reconstitute themselves without attachment to the idea that a band is a traditional entity.
But that's why I think Harold is on the right track by talking about, and even the Minister of INEC, it's all about institutions. While people are making their own determination about what that should be, it should not be another Indian Act creation that determines what the number ought to be, right? The institutional array where you set objectives, where you set standards, where you set practices of what it takes to be part of these kinds of behaviors, I think you're on a better track there where there's faster progress to be made than one where we sort of circle the wagons and have 634 people shooting at the center. Sure. I mean, I don't know what...
Well, just another point, if you'll forgive me here, and I'd certainly be interested in what everybody has to say about it, but I direct it to Paul. The government has made a political promise to somehow implement the UN Declaration. And I think, if memory serves, Article 26 calls for the creation of a process by which the matters spoken of across the whole of UNDRIP can be advanced. Now, if UNDRIP is to be implemented, surely there's a need for some process to engage with Indigenous groups in their proper collectives. And is there not a role for the federal government in bringing that about? We've seen in Australia how the federal authority enacted the National Native Title Tribunal and created a process that has forced everybody that needs to be at the table to the table. Now, it's for, it seems to me, the Indigenous peoples to define their collectives, but the common law has some markers for what constitutes an Indigenous nation. Those too have to be respected. So, Paul, have you given thought to how that part of UNDRIP could be advanced in the interest of having the negotiation that you've spoke of with subsidiarity?
That problem has been addressed in theory. I'm not aware that anyone has tackled it very well in practice. I think it was around 1998 that one of the main human rights treaty bodies made its observations about Canada and its performance in respect to the international right of self-determination. And in those observations, the Human Rights Committee, I forget which one it was, observed that the Federal Royal Commission's recommendations on nation-to-nation relationships were appropriate domestic implementation of the international law right of self-determination of peoples. And we know that that is at the heart of the UN Declaration. Although, of course, if we had more time, we could qualify that in a number of ways. But when we look at the question, has that happened, where one would look for aggregated communities larger than the little ones. Otherwise, you don't have a lot of capacity. It's not appropriate to do big-scale things with very small-scale communities. If we look around the country, well, we have a BC Treaty Commission. Miles and others here have a lot of experience with that. And I actually have a chapter in a book on this myself way back when, looking at comparing the BC Treaty Commission experience with the RCAP recommendations on nation-to-nation relationship. And some people here would be better qualified to speak about that than I would be, but I don't think that concept of nation really took hold, so far as I can tell. By and large, the communities that did negotiate treaties were relatively small communities. I think some of the more modern treaties, perhaps like Nunavut, and the Labrador ones maybe cover a larger territory, and you know, they have different approaches there. If you look at the membership code, for example, in the Labrador Inuit Constitution, I think that's a laudable change. I'm not using the word progress, but a laudable change in respect to the way that people view you know, their membership and getting away from this, you know, Indian Ag Band concept. But I suppose the short answer is people have come up with good ideas for practical progress. That's a lot more difficult. The issues are extremely complex, and there's a great burden on local politicians, which is quite overwhelming, and so the expectations are very great on them, and we have to appreciate that as well.
Thanks, Paul. Harold, your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to go back to the fact that it took Squamish 4 years to negotiate to come back together with 16 Indian bands. And I spoke about the need for patience. Canada needs to invest in supporting a process to see if reconstitution of our nations can occur. That's just the bottom line. It can't occur without that. Some of what's happened in in the resource-rich areas have been in linear projects. Multiple First Nations have had to come together to deal with complex issues. And so there's been some ability to bring those communities together to sit down and have a conversation that is leading them to a conversation about reconstituting their nations. I mean, 4 years ago when I first went into the Gitxsan country, it was at the risk of your life to talk about these matters. But they're now sitting down after 4 years and saying, we need to reconstitute. So it's going to take some time. I think it's worth the effort. I think that in the meantime, we have to take these provisional steps. I always remember the late Jim Prentice speaking to us in Prince Rupert at an LNG gathering, and he said, you're not going to get what you think you deserve. You're going to get what you negotiate. And that's a reality that we as First Nations have to come to grips with. We also have to come to grips with the reality that there's strength in numbers. If we're going to go back to the Supreme Court of Canada, I'd like to go back with 634 Indian bands, not with one. Because as I was trained as I was articled by Harry.
Very disobedient student, I might add.
But as I look at this scenario, I think that the Supreme Court has continued to provide us opportunity until we don't take advantage of that opportunity. And then they're going to put the Canadian interest ahead of ours. I'm the pessimist with him. So we need to change our attitude around these issues, and it's not going to be easy. They're not easy conversations, and they will take time, and they will take an investment by Canada to provide the resources to facilitate that conversation.
And I would think an exercise of federal power if it comes to that.
Yes.
If there's enough First Nation, I mean, this is the catch-22. You can't say down with colonialism except for when it feels good. Yeah. So I think Canada has to invest, and as do the provinces, and I think that there has to be patience. But I don't think that stops progress from being made on the institutional and framework front. Because at the end of the day, the interest of leadership across all of those communities is to make life better for their citizens, just like every other level of government, which for me is enough to start from there. And you know, I'm from other parts of Canada, and I look and I say 500, and I'm a historian by trade, I look at 500 years of history where you have always made room for us. You know what? You will again. So I have to have faith, because that's what this journey is about. It's not about the old laws we constituted and we wanted to do awful things to each other. It's about how we're going to share this journey together. And if we can't start with some sense of faith in each other that we're trying to get to the right place, well, no amount of laws and no amount of federal force being exercised is going to save us from ourselves.
Okay. I don't know who's the time cop here, but I suspect it's me. And I see we're way over time. So, Barry, is it best that we wrap up?
We do it.
So people can get on with dinner and what have you?
Is this working?
Nope.
Barry, they have to set up the room for dinner, eh? We have to get out of here.
Yeah, we've actually started the reception outside without people.
You started the reception outside. Well, then I'm amazed there are that many people in the room.
It's 5:30 and dinner starts at 6:30 with former ambassador Keith Harper. What are we right now? We're at 5:30, so 6:30. And I mean, we could ask one quick question. Okay, we got it. We've got to open it up just for a second.
Sorry, look, I know everybody wants to leave, but I'm with the Mining Association of Manitoba. I'm very much looking forward to my first meeting with Chief Merker. I just joined the organization. We play a role in supporting and promoting good relationships between Indigenous communities and nations, the province, and the mining sector. One of the issues that's coming up in Manitoba, and I've heard other people refer to it as a powder keg, is overlapping jurisdiction between First Nations and the Métis Nation. So in this conversation and in a lot of the titles, we use the word Indigenous, and people respectfully mention Métis and Inuit, but it seems to me that most of this is centered on First Nations issues and court decisions, etc. So when we talk to the Métis in Manitoba, what we hear is, Tom Isaac says that treaty rights don't trump Aboriginal rights, Section 35. I hear chiefs say, well, sure, the Métis can sit at the table as long as they understand that if there's any overlap, that, you know, they take a back seat because these are treaty rights we're talking about. So when we talk about slow additions to reserve process and we talk about land-based jurisdiction, I'm really interested to hear how you folks think the Métis Nation fits into this. With recent court decisions, with Métis people asserting their rights, how do you think this is going to unfold?
For my part, thank goodness I'm still a judge, so I can't touch that one.
Well, I have had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Manitoba in the last year. Have begun to appreciate the unique circumstances of many of those communities. Drove 3.5 hours to Little Saskatchewan First Nation on the edge of Lake Manitoba and realized there's very little there. What you've got are circumstances where people are arguing over scraps, inadequate resources, no opportunities, no employment. The politicians on both sides, Aboriginal and Métis, can have a field day in that environment. the way those things got settled in British Columbia with 16 First Nations along a corridor to the coast is they had an equity opportunity. They had impact benefit agreements. There were investments that were going to be made in their communities. And they were forced to sit in a room and develop an allocation system between themselves. And that's what's going to happen. And there are, one of the successes of the Financial Management Board in the last year has been the ability to create that dynamic in northern British Columbia. And to have those communities now establish themselves as a society that's going to be funded by the federal government on an ongoing basis to engage in those kind of conversations. I know it seems like a bit of a, what the hell is the Financial Management Board doing this stuff? But if you look at our purposes, they're quite wide-ranging to support Aboriginal economic development, access to capital, all of those kinds of things. And in many cases, it takes somebody who is recognized as having come from a community and done many of the things that they've done to, quite frankly, do what I did here today, and that's to get up and speak quite frankly. Because after 30 years, there's not much that I haven't seen. And there's more in the rearview mirror than there is through the windshield for me. And I don't have a lot of time left. We're going to race ourselves to the other side, Ovid and I.
My hearing is so bad, I did not hear one word. So all I can say is you could ask me the question later. In the meantime, I will say whatever Harold said.
Gaelic as la hamas lo klatsai. Nu guam odi guys la ka kwechosut in kwat me spuskama zaureno. La man gagam kliklamogilo la kwatmis. My traditional name is Owadi, and I've introduced myself this way so I can demonstrate to you that I know who I am and I know where I'm from. My grandmother is Gugwe, and her father was Yachaslanis, and my mother's father is Kliklamogilo. And I'm really grateful for the discussion here today, but I've taken copious notes so I can present this to our nation in upcoming discussions. I'm truly grateful. And I just needed to share, because I've heard something here about the Royal Proclamation. And I know what I know and believe. And I know each of us are talking through our lens of understanding. But our people's existence, title, rights, jurisdiction, authorities, are not creatures of Crown statute, period. It is inherent to who we are and where we're from. I remember as a little boy jigging cod with my Uncle Georgie, and just what a treasured gift that was for me as a little boy. And the Royal Proclamation, the statements I've heard, I think that perhaps that's the ramp onto the highway of reconciliation for Canada, for us to point at so they understand in their own construct about why they must come and join us. But I just felt it really critical to point out that our jurisdiction and authority is inherent to who we are, inherent to the lands and origin stories. And I'm mindful of my Uncle Michael, who taught me how to sing and taught me of our culture. And then when he passed, I learned and realized he was teaching me how to live. And when he spoke to me quite clearly about our stories of origin, he always said to me, he said, no origin story is more important than another. They all just are. And when I realized that when Canada embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they were verifying and they were supporting what my uncle taught me about our culture and our peoples. I just wanted to make sure that that statement is made, and I'm really grateful for all your comments, and I'm really hoping I did my notes justice by what I've captured. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we can start at the reception outside right now. Sorry, folks. Thank you. Bye.